Hello everybody, welcome to me reading you another Alex Rider book. Chapter 16, Made in Britain. There was a vase of roses on the table. Alex smelled them first. Sweet and slightly coiling, then he opened his eyes and allowed them to come into focus. The roses were brightly pink, a dozen of them arranged in porcelain with vase with a lace mat underneath. Alex felt sick. The side of his head was throbbing, and he could feel the broken skin where the walking stick had hit him. There was a sour taste in his mouth. It was dark outside, and he wondered how long he had been here. And where was he? Looking at the antique furniture, the grandfather clock with heavy curtains, and the stone fireplace with two sculptured lions, he would have said he was back in Britain. Although he knew that wasn't possible. He was lying on a bed in what could have been a country hotel. A door to one side opened into an en-suite bathroom. There were bottles of molten brown shampoo and bubble bath beside the wash basin. Alex rolled off the bed and staggered into the bathroom. He splashed water on his face and examined himself in the mirror. He looked terrible, quite apart from the dark hair and skin colour and the two fake teeth. His eyes were bloodshot. There was a huge bruise next to his eye, and generally he looked as if he had been dumped here by a rubbish and pulled the two plastic caps off his teeth. Major knew perfectly well who and what he was. There was no need for any further pretense. He ran himself a bath, and while the tub was filling him, he went back into the bedroom. The main door was locked, of course. The window looked out onto a perfectly lawn. Bizarrely, a set of crooked hoops arranged in neat lines. Beyond in the moonlight, he could see a rocky outcrop, a jetty, and the sea. Someone had left him a snack. Smoked salmon sandwiches, a glass of milk, a plain of McVitie's Jaffa cake. He ate the lot greedily. Then he stripped off and got into bath. He didn't know what was going to happen next, and he didn't like to think. But whatever it was, he might as well be clean. He felt a lot better after half an hour in the hot, scented water. And although he hadn't been able to get off all the makeup Miss Webber had given him, at least some of his own colour had returned. There were fresh clothes in the wardrobe, a Vivian Westwood shirt and Paul Smith jeans and underwear, both London-based designers. He still had his old clothes, but the belt Smiths had given him had been removed. Alex wondered about that, and later he discovered the knife in the buckle, or jungle supplies hidden in the leather itself. He was sorry he had the chance to use it. Maybe there would have been something inside that could have helped him now. Luckily, nobody had searched the pockets of his jeans, or if they had missed the 10-baht coin and the chewing gum packet with the secret detonators. The watch was also untouched. The hands fixed at 11 o'clock, and that gave Alex a sense of reassurance. The 11th hour. Indeed, maybe you might think he held all the cards, but the watch would still be transmitting. And even now, MI6 Special Operations had to be closing in. Alex got dressed in the new clothes and sat down in the comfortable armchair. He even began to read Biggles, The Famous Five, and William. They weren't quite to his taste, but he supposed he should appreciate the thought. A few minutes later, there was a rattle of a key, turning the lock, and the door opened. A maid wearing a black dress and white apron came in. She looked Indonesian. Major Yu would like to invite you to dinner, she says. That's very kind of him, Alex replied. He closed. Biggles investigates. I don't suppose there's any chance of eating our way out. He's in the dining room, the maid replied. Alex followed her out of the room and down a wood panelled corridor with old paintings on the walls. They were all scenes of English countryside. Briefly, he thought of overpowering the maid and making another bid for freedom, but he decided against it. There was a part of him that reacted against the idea of attacking a young woman. And anyway, he had no doubt, following the events of Library and Star, he would be taking no chances. Security here would be tight. They reached a grand staircase that swept beside a second monumental fireplace. More English landscape paintings everywhere. Alex had to remind himself that he was still in Australia. The house didn't fit him. It felt as if it had been imported brick by brick. And he was reminded for a moment of Nicole Jevon, who had transported his own 14th century castle from Scotland to Oxfordshire. It was strange how very bad men felt a need to live in somewhere not just spectacular, but slightly insane. The maid held back and gestured Alex through a door into a long dining room with floor to ceiling windows looking out over the sea. The room was carpeted. The room was carpeted and had a table and a dozen chairs. In this room were modern, a portrait by David Hockney and a Wheel of Colour by Damien Hirst. Alex had seen similar works in galleries in London and knew that they had to be worth millions. Only one end at the table had been laid. Major Yu was sitting there waiting for him, the walking stick leaning against his chair. "Ah, there you are, Alex," he said in a pleasant voice, as if they were old friends meeting up for the weekend. "Please come and sit down." As he walked forward, Alex examined the Snakehead boss properly for the first time, taking in the round, shrunken head, the wireframe glasses, the white hair, that sat so oddly with their Chinese features. Yu was wearing a striped blazer with a white open-neck shirt. There was a silk handkerchief poking out of his pocket. His gloved hands were crossed in front of him. "How are you feeling?" Yu asked. "How are you feeling?" Yu asked. "My head hurts," Alex replied. "Yes, I'm afraid I must apologize. I really don't know what came over me, hitting you like that. But the truth is, I was angry. You did a lot of damage on the Library and Star and made it necessary for me to kill Captain De Winter, which I didn't really want to do. Alex filed the information away. So De Winter was dead. He had paid the price for failing a second time. Even so, it was unforgivable of me. My mother used to say that you can lose money. You can lose at cards, but you should never lose your temper. Can I offer you some apple juice? It comes from High House Fruit Farm in Suffolk. It's quite delicious. Thank you, Alex said. He didn't know what was going on here, but he decided he might as well play along with this madman. He held out his glass and you poured, and he did so. The Indonesian maid came in with the dinner. Roast beef and Yorkshire pudding. Alex helped himself. He noticed that you ate very little, and he held his knife and fork as if they were surgical implements. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to meet you, Major You. Ever since you destroyed our Operation Invisible Sword and caused the death of poor Miss Rothman, I've been wondering what sort of boy you were. So Miss Jones had been right. Major You was indeed part of Scorbia. Alex understood with a sense of dread that it gave you another reason to want to kill him. To settle an old score. It's just a shame that we have so little time together, he went on. Alex didn't like the sound of that. I have a question, he said. Please, go ahead. Where is Ash? What have you done with him? Let's not talk about Ash. You gave him a thin smile. You don't have to worry about him. You'll never see him again. How is the beef, by the way? A little bloody for my taste. He sighed. It's organic from Yorkshire. Where else? Alex was getting a bit fed up with all this. He toyed with his knife, wondering if he had the speed and determination to stick it into the man's heart. It might be 5 or 10 minutes before the maid came back. Enough time to find a way out of here. You must have seen the idea forming out his eyes. Please don't try anything foolish, he remarked. There's a pistol in my right-hand jacket pocket, and as the Americans would say, I'm very quick on the draw. I could shoot you dead before you have even left your chair. That would spoil a perfectly pleasant meal. So come now, Alex. I want to know about you. Where were you born? Alex shrugged. West London. Your parents were both English? Don't want to talk about them. Alex looked around him. Certainly the patrons, the furniture, the clothes, even the food made sense. You seem to like England, Major You, he remarked. I admire it greatly, if I may say so. Alex, I have enjoyed having you as an advisor because you are British. It's also one of the reasons I have invited you to dine with me now. But what about Invisible Sword? You tried to kill every school child in London. That was business, and I really was very unhappy about it. But you might also like to know that I voted against sending a sniper to kill you. It seems so crude. More apple juice? No, thank you. No, thank you. So where do you go to school? Alex shook his head. He had enough of this game. Don't want to talk about myself, he said. I'm certainly not you. I want to see Ash, and I want to go home. Neither of which is possible. Major You was drinking wine. Alex noticed even that was English. He remembered Iron Rider once describing English wine as unnatural, undesirable, and undrinkable. But you sipped it with obvious enthusiasm. I love England, as a matter of fact, he said. Since you want to talk about yourself, perhaps you will permit me to tell you a little bit about me. My life has been remarkable. Maybe one day someone will write a book about me. I've never much cared for horror stories. Alex said. He smiled again, but his eyes were cold. I like to think of myself as a genius, he began. Of course, you might remark that I've never invented anything or written a novel or painting a great painting. And despite what I've said, it's unlikely that I will become a household name. But different people are talented in different ways, and I think I've achieved a certain greatness in time. And it's not surprising that my life story is a remarkable one. How could someone like me have anything other? He coughed, dabbing his lips, and began again. I was born in Hong Kong, although you wouldn't believe it to look at me now. I began with nothing. My cot was a cardboard box filled with straw. My mother was Chinese. She lived in a single room in a slum and worked at a hotel and worked as a chambermaid at the famous Victoria Hotel. Sometimes she would smuggle home soaps and shampoos for me. It was the only luxury I ever knew. My father was a guest there, a businessman from Tunbridge Wells in Kent. She never told me his name. The two of them began an affair, and I have to say that she fell hopelessly in love with him. He used to talk about the place where he lived, the country called Great Britain. He promised her that as soon as she had enough money, he would take her with him, and he would turn her into an English lady with a thatched cottage and a garden and a bulldog. For my mother, who had a garden, for my mother, who had nothing, it was an impossible dream. I'm sure you have no attachment to your country, being young. Truth is, it's a remarkable place. At one time, this tiny island had an empire that stretched all around the world. You have to remember that when I was born, you have to remember that when I was born, you even owned Hong Kong. Think how many inventors and explorers, artists, writers, soldiers and statesmen have come out of Britain. William Shakespeare, Charles Dickens. The computer was a British invention, as was the World Wide Web. It's sad and much of your country's greatness had been squandered by politicians in the recent years. But I still have faith in one day Britain will once again lead the world. Anyway, my mother's affair came to an unhappy end. I suppose it was inevitable. As soon as he found out that she was pregnant, the businessman abandoned her, and she never saw her again. Nor did he ever pay a penny towards my upkeep. He simply disappeared. But my mother never lost sight of her dream. If anything, it became more intense. She was determined that I should grow up with full recognition of my English blood. She named me Winston Churchill. The first clothes I wore had been made in Britain. As the years went on, she decided that I should be educated in a British public. I should be educated in a British public school. Even though it was obviously quite impossible. When she was earning only a few pounds an hour, changing beds and cleaning toilets, but nothing less. When I was 6 years old, she left her job and began to look for other ways to make money. It took her just 2 years, a tribute, I think, to her single-mindedness and courage. And that was how I found myself at a prep school in Tunbridge Wells itself, and later at Harrow, dressed in a smart blue jacket with marvellous straw hats. All the boys wore them. On Sundays we dressed in cut-off tailcoats, bomb freezers, we used to call them. It's Winston Churchill's old school, and I found it hard to believe I was there. I mean, I could actually imagine I might be sitting at his desk or reading a book that had once belonged to him. It was thrilling, and my mother was so proud of me. I did sometimes wonder how she could possibly afford it all, but it wasn't until the end of my second term that I found out. And I must say, it came as a bit of a surprise. This is what happened. He poured himself some more wine, swirled it round the glass, and drank. You might imagine that I was bullied at Harrow, he said. After all, this was back in the 50s, and there weren't many half-Chinese boys there, particularly with a single parent. By and large, everyone was very kind to me. However, there was one boy, a chap by the name of Max Odie. He had a brother called Felix, and I must say, I liked both of them. Max was a pleasant enough chap, very good with money. Anyway, I don't know what I did to upset him, but he made a lot of rather hurtful remarks, and for a couple of terms, thanks to him, life was very uncomfortable. But then my mother heard about it, and I'm afraid she dealt with him very servilely. A hit and run. I never found the driver, but I knew who it was, and I was horrified. It was a sign of my mother. I had never seen it before. And that was when I discovered the truth. It turned out that when I was just 6 years old, she had managed to track down one of the main snakehead operator in Hong Kong, and volunteered services as a paid thing. I know it sounds remarkable, but I suppose that being abandoned so cruelly had changed her. She no longer had any respect for life. And the fact was, she was extremely good at her new job. She was very small and Chinese. Nobody ever suspected her, and she was utterly without mercy. Because that was how she was supporting me at Harrow. Every time a bill arrived at the start of a new term, she had to go out and kill someone. It's a strange thing that 15 men died to make my education possible. 16, in fact, when I decided to take up horse riding. After she'd finished with Max, I never had any more trouble. Even the teachers went out of their way to pleasant to me. I was made head boy in my last term. Well, between you and me, I was the second choice. What happened to the first choice? He fell off a roof from Harrow I went along to university when I studied politics, and after that I joined the army. I was sent to Sandhurst, and I'll never forget the day of my passing out parade when I received a medal from the Queen. I'm afraid it was all too much for my mother. A few weeks later she died quite suddenly, a massive heart attack, they said. I was shaken to the core because I loved her very much. And here's something you might like to know. I bribed one of the gardeners and had her ashes scattered in the grounds of Buckingham Palace in the roses. I knew it was something she would have appreciated. Major Yu had finally finished eating, and the maid suddenly appeared to clear the dishes. Alex wondered how she had known when to arrive. Pudding was rubber crumbles served with cream, board, cheddar, Stilton, and red Leicester, all English, of course. There's not much more to tell, you continued. I served with distinction in Northern Ireland and was given a letter of commendation. I was happy in the army, as I have been at Harrow. Happier. In fact, I discovered that I rather enjoyed killing people. particularly for Jeans. I rose to the rank of Major, and it was then that the great tragedy of my life occurred. I was diagnosed with a quite serious illness, a rare form of osteoporosis, known as a brittle bone disease. That then tells you everything you need to know. What it meant was that my bones had become very fragile. In recent years, the condition had got considerably worse. As you can see, I need a stick to walk, and I am forced to wear gloves to protect my hands. It is as if my entire skeleton is made of glass, and the slightest blow could cause a terrible injury. You must be all broken up about that, Alex remarked. I shall ignore your late attempts at humour, you remarked. Soon you will have cause to regret them. He poured himself a glass of wine. I was forced to leave active service, but that was not the end of my career. I still had an excellent mind, and I was recommended for a job in intelligence in MI6. That was quite a coincidence, don't you think? In other circumstances, you and I could have been working together. Unfortunately, I didn't quite work out the way. You see, at first, I thought it was all going to be very exciting. I imagined myself as quite the young James Bond, but I was never invited to be part of special operations like you, Alex. Never met Lunt or Miss Jones. I was sent to the communication centre in Cheltenham, a desk job. Can you imagine someone like me slaving away from 9 to 5 in a boring little office, surrounded by secretaries and coffee machines? It was miserable, and after a while I knew that my disease was getting worse, that it would only be a matter of time before I'd be thrown out at the scrap heap. So I decided to look out for myself. Despite everything, a lot of information that passed my way at Cheltenham was highly sensitive and confidential, and of course there was a market for stuff like that. So very carefully I began to steal secrets from British intelligence, and where I took them, I went to the very Snakehead which employed my mother. And when she was in Hong Kong, they were delighted to have me, like mother, like son. In the end, I had to resign from MI6. The Snakehead were paying me a fortune, and they were offering me all sorts of career opportunities. Very quickly, I rose up the ladder until by the early 80s, I had become number 2 in what was now the most powerful criminal organisation in Southeast Asia. And I suppose number 1 fell off the roof. And I said, as a matter of fact, he drowned. But you seem to have got the general idea. You smiled. Anyway, it was about this time that I heard rumours of a new organisation that was being formed by people who, in their own way, quite similar to me. I decided to diversify and use my snake connections. I managed to contact them, and eventually we met up in Paris to finalise details. That, of course, was the birth of Scorpia, and I was one of their founding members. So, what are you doing now? Why do you need Royal Blue? Major U had been helping himself to cheese. He froze with a piece of cheddar at the end of his knife. You saw the bomb? I said nothing. There was no point of denying it. You really are a very capable young man, Alex. I see now that we were quite unwise to underestimate you last time. Major, you dropped the cheese onto his plate and reached for the biscuit. I'm going to tell you what the bomb is for, because it will amuse me, he went on. But then I'm afraid we've chatted We've chatted for quite long enough. Where am I going, Meiji? We'll get to that in a minute. Cheese? Do you have any brie? Personally, I find French cheese disgusting. He ate silently for a moment. This is an island in the Timor Seas, not very far from the northwest coast of Australia. Its name is Reef Island. You may have heard of it before. Alice remembered the news report he had heard on board the Librarian Star. A conference was to take place there in a few days' time. The alternative to the G8 summit. A meeting of famous people who were trying to make the world a better place. Scorpio had been given the job of destroying the island and the 8 so-called celebrities who will be upon it, he went on. He sounded pleased with himself. Alex imagined one of the problems of being a criminal was that you can never tell anyone about your crimes. But what makes the task particularly interesting is that we have to make it look like an accident. So you're not going to blow them up? Alex said. No, Alex. That won't work at all. You have to be much more subtle. Let me explain. He swallowed a piece of cheese and dabbed his lips with his napkin. As it happens, Reef Island is located in what is known as a subduction zone. It means perhaps you studied that in geography. What it means is that under sea a few hundred miles north of the island, there are 2 tectonic plates pressing against each other with a fault line between them. Among its many business interests, the China Trading Company is involved in deep sea oil exploration and leases an oil platform in the Timor Sea. In the last couple of months, I've arranged for a shaft to drive into the seabed precisely over the fault line. This was quite a feat of engineering, Alex. We used the same reverse circulation system that was developed to build the ventilation shafts. That was developed to build the ventilation shaft for the Hong Kong Underground Railway. But I'm delighted to say that it was designed by Seacor, a British company. Once step ahead of the world. You won't believe the pipe running down from the sphere will be no more than 13 centimeters in diameter by the time it hit the oil field. However, our shaft will have ample room for royal blue. We will place the bomb 1 kilometer below the surface of the seabed. I will then travel to the oil platform and personally detonate it. But what was the point? Alex went through what he had just been told and suddenly he understood. He knew exactly what the result would be. Not just an explosion, but something much, much worse. You're going to keep the horror out of his voice. You're going to cause a wave? He said, a huge wave? Go on, Alex. You couldn't keep the glee out of his voice. A tsunami. Alex whispered the word. He could see it clearly. That was what had happened on 26th of December 2004. An earthquake under the sea. A tsunami that had hit first Sumatra and even reached the coast of Somalia. More than 200,000 people had died. Exactly. The bomb will have the effect of the lubricating fault line. You rested one hand on top of the other. This will force one of the plates to rise. He lifted the upper hand at a few centimeters. The result will be a deep water wave, just 1 meter high. I wouldn't think it could do much harm, but as it approaches the coastline where the seabed began to rise, the front will slow down and the rest of the water will pile up behind. By the time it hits the time it hits Reef Island, a 30-meter wall of water will have formed, travelling at about 550 miles an hour, the speed of a jumbo jet. 1 cubic meter of water weighs about 1 ton, Alex. Imagine hundreds of cubic meters rushing in. There'll be no warning. The island will be destroyed. It is low-lying. There'll be nowhere to hide. Every building will be smashed. Every single person on the island will be killed. But the tsunami won't stop there, Alex exclaimed. What will happen to it after that? That's a very intelligent observation. The tsunami will unleash the same amount of energy as 7,000 nuclear weapons. It will continue on its way until it hits Australia. We'll be all the way up here in Darwin, but I'm afraid a very large section of the western coast will disappear. Everything from Derby to Carnarvon, unfortunately, there's nowhere very important or even attractive in that part of the country. Broome, Port Hedland. Few people have even heard of these places, and they're not exactly overpopulated. I wouldn't expect more than 10 or 20,000 people to die, but I don't understand. I could feel his chest tightening. You're going to do all this just to kill 8 people? Perhaps you didn't hear what I said. Their deaths have to look accidental. Our job is to make the world forget that this stupid conference was ever organised, and so we will provide a natural disaster on a massive scale. Who will care about the extinction of 8 people when the number of deaths rises into the thousands? Who remember a little island when an entire continent has been hit? But they'll know it was you. They'll know it all started with a bomb. That would be true if we used a nuclear bomb. This is an intentional network of seismographs, the Poseidon satellite in outer space, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, and so on. But a blast made by Royal Blue won't register. It will be lost as the tectonic plates shift and the devastation begins. Alex tried to make sense of what he was hearing. He'd been sent to uncover a smuggling operation, and somehow instead he had stumbled into this terrible nightmare. Another attempt by Scorpio to change the world. He had to stop himself, glancing at his watch. Hours had passed since he had set the hands to 11 o'clock. Surely MI6 were on their way. I expect you're wondering whether such a relatively small bomb will really be able to cause such havoc, Meiji continued. There's only one other thing that you need to know. As luck would have it in 4 days' time, a rather astronomical term for it. But what we're talking about is the alignment of the sun, the earth, and the moon. And the moon is going to be particularly close. At midnight, it will be as close as ever as it ever is. As a result, there will be particularly strong gravitational pull on the Earth's surface. I'm sorry, Alice, I'm beginning to sound like a school teacher. Let me put it more simply. The sun will be pulling one way, the moon will be pulling the other. And for just 1 hour, From the moment of midnight, the tectonic plates will be at their most volatile. A single explosion on the stroke of midnight will be more enough to begin. A single explosion on the stroke of midnight will be more enough to begin the process I have described. Royal blue is the perfect weapon for all needs. Undetectable, invisible, all above all, and above all, British. I'm very proud of that. You fell silent, and in that moment, Alex heard the drone of a plane. He looked out the window and saw that a series of floodlights had been turned on. There was a seaplane circling, a tiny two-seater with floats instead of wheels. It could land on the water right outside the house and tie up on the jetty that Alex had seen from his room. He knew it had come for him. "Where have you taken me?" he demanded. "Oh yes, now we come to the rub." Maisie sat back, and suddenly the gun was in his hand, pointing at Alex. He had certainly moved quickly. Alex hadn't even seen him draw it. The easiest and perhaps the most sensible thing would be to shoot you now, he said. "In half an hour you could be at the bottom of the ocean, and neither Miss Jones nor Eastern Brook will never know what happened to you." "But I'm not going to do that." "Why?" "Why? 2 reasons. The first thing is that I really don't want to get blood on the carpet. You may have noticed that it's Axminster, from the town of Axminster. From the town of Axminster, Devon. The second is most personal. You owe me a great deal of money. Alex, you have to pay for the damage it caused on the Library and Star, and that is still a rather more considerable debt that you owe to Scorpia following the collapse of Invisible Sword. The truth is, although you may not realize it right now, you are worth a great deal to me alive." How much now? You are worth a great deal to me alive. How much have I told you about my snakehead? Who else? People smuggling weapons, drugs, these are all part of my organisation. I have another highly profitable business based a couple of 100 miles from here in a facility hidden in the heart of the Australian jungle. The facility does deal in the sale of human organs. Alex said nothing. No words would come. "Do you know how hard is it to find a kidney donor if you are rich and live in the West?" You pointed the gun at Alex's stomach. "I'll be able to sell your kidney for £100,000. The operation won't even kill you. You will live through it, and after that we'll be able to come back. Perhaps for your eyes." The gun rose up to the level of Alex's head. "Your eyes will sell for £20,000 each, leaving you blind." "For £20,000 each, leaving you blind? Otherwise in good health." The gun dropped, the gun dropped again. "You can live without your pancreas. You'll make me further £50,000 while you are recovering from each operation. I'll drain off your blood and your plasma. They'll be kept frozen and sorted at £500 a pint. And finally, of course, there's your heart. The heart of a young, healthy boy could fetch up to £1 million. See, Alex, shooting you does me no good at all. But keeping you alive is good for business, and you might even get some satisfaction in knowing when you do eventually die, that you have restored the health of quite a few people around the world." Alex swore. He spat out every foul word he knew. But Major was no longer listening. door to the dining room opened again. This time it was the maid who came in. 2 men in dozing like the maid. Alex hadn't seen them before. One placed a hand on his shoulder, but Alex shrugged it off and stood up on his own. He wasn't going to let them drag him up on his own. He was going to let them drag him out of here. We'll fly you out tomorrow morning, Major, you said. He can ask briefly at the treatment. Make sure he's locked up. Don't let him out of your sight. One last look at Alex. Would you like an after 8 before you leave? I said nothing. Major, you signalled. The two men took him away. That's the end of me reading you this chapter. So goodbye, everyone, and thank you for listening to this.